Good morning, everyone. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this special Silver Scholar occasion that we are celebrating this weekend. It's a joy to see all of you and to start on Jewish time, approximately 10 minutes late. I'm glad that you're all here. It's really lovely to see all of you. I also would like to welcome those of us who are joining us from elsewhere. I've heard from a number of you who joined us also last night. Thank you for joining us. Today we're in for a special treat. Today we're in for a special moment of recognition, and this moment of recognition really relates directly to the legacy of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver and to the contemporary implications of that legacy. We are going to start out by hearing about the digitization project wherein the archives of our Rabbi Silver that are housed at the Western Reserve Historical Society are now going to be made available online to different people, and the remarkable effort that this represents. And we are going to be starting out hearing about this from two very special people whom I would like to very briefly introduce. One is Dr. Sean Martin. Dr. Sean Martin is our the Jewish archival authority at the Western Reserve Historical Society. Dr. Martin has earned 2 master's degrees from The Ohio State University, as well as a doctorate from The Ohio State University in history with a concentration on Jewish East European history. He has taught extensively, including traveling to Krakow on a number of occasions and teaching between the United States and Krakow. Has taught and has worked with Case Western Reserve University. And I have to say that of all the people who are gathered here, there really is no one in this city, there is no one who has done more to preserve the legacy of the documents of our Jewish community here through the Western Reserve Historical Society and in collaboration with others in this community than Sean Martin. So we are delighted to have you here, and we are thrilled to welcome you here on this very special weekend. And Dr. Martin is going to be joined by Lisa Frankel from the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Lisa Frankel joined Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in the mid-1980s. She hails from Columbus and arrived at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati with a marketing degree and has started working very quickly with Rabbi and then Rabbi Dr. Gary Zola. From the mid-1990s onwards, she has worked in the American Jewish Archives as the right-hand person of Rabbi Dr. Gary Zola. At the time, the American Jewish Archives was a very different institution. It was a much smaller institution. But with the acquisition of the World Jewish Congress collection, the Bnei B'rith International collection, a whole number of other very prominent collections, today, the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives is the largest repository of American Judaica and Hebraica anywhere in one location in the world, housed on the Cincinnati campus. And Lisa Frankel has been involved in every single aspect of the growth and of the work of the American Jewish Archives, working alongside Rabbi Dr. Zola for now approximately 3.5 decades, and is beloved by faculty, by staff, by students in Cincinnati, and is missed by me here in Cleveland. We will be hearing from both Sean Martin and Lisa Frankel, and I'd like to invite you to launch our presentation this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce the project to you. Really, it's the first time that we've really spoken.
If you don't speak to the mic, the streaming people won't hear you.
Is this on? OK. It's wonderful to be here to introduce the project publicly here. So this is actually quite an extensive project. And I want to really start with a slide of the Western Reserve. We are the Western Reserve Historical Society, our local historical society for Northeast Ohio. I work in the Jewish archives there. My position is to collect materials from the local Jewish community, process those materials, and make them available to the public. I wanted to start with a slide of the map of the Western Reserve, really just to drive home the point that this project really is important to the larger community, not just of the region, but really, of course, as you know, because of the stature of both of the rabbis, it's important to our national and international communities as well. This is a digitization project that involves digitizing, scanning materials from 11 different collections, over 300,000 documents, images, 900 audio recordings, and 25 films. Those materials came into the Historical Society in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, donated by the Temple and by the Silver family. And really, they are our most important collections within the Jewish archives, I think it is fair to say. The Historical Society, at one point, did its own microfilming. And I want to start with the microfilming for just a moment. Hopefully, many of you recall these old microfilm machines. We've got an old one picture on the left, a new one on the right. This was the way that we used to make the materials accessible to larger audiences. We microfilmed the materials, and then we actually sold the microfilm to, I think, about 7 or 8 different institutions throughout the world so that scholars in Israel, in New York City, California could access the collections. That's still where we are. If people want to access the collections today, they will go to the academic libraries where the microfilm is held, and they will use the microfilm. But thanks to many in the community, we are now able to digitize these materials and make them available to researchers anywhere. This is a project that really was spearheaded by Adele Silver. She talked to the Historical Society about the prospect of digitizing these materials really as early as 2000. So it really is wonderful to be here in 2022 talking about this. And of course, it's a costly project. And we're very grateful to the Silver family, the Silver Fund of the Temple-Tifereth Israel, John and Peggy Garson, Marvin and Carol Lader, the Martz Family Foundation, and an anonymous donor as well for making the support of the project possible that allows us to do what we do. It's very much a team project. I'm thrilled to say that the American Jewish Archives is our partner in this, making what is a daunting project for the Historical Society quite a possible one and a manageable one. And so I've listed all of the people from the Historical Society and from the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Of course, I've also need to express my thanks to the Federation for the support of the Jewish Archives at the Historical Society. But now I just want to say a few words about so what happens with all these sermons, correspondence, programs, minutes, et cetera, that we have. Essentially, what we do is we work with vendors to make this possible for us. So we're working with the Crowley Company, Digital Divide Data, Scene Savers. They are the ones who are actually doing the scanning. But then I want to really explain why this project takes so long. We are about a year out from the realization of this project, from sending you the link to the site from which you can search for your family names, for any topic you're interested in. We started with a digitization of a smaller collection of photographs from Abba Hillel Silver. These are now available on the website of the Historical Society in our digital repository. Digital Cleveland starts here. And If you go to that site, you'll see a brief description of the collection. And I just pulled one photograph to show you. This is from a dinner in which we can see Abba Hillel Silver, and then also other figures like Chaim Weizmann and Albert Einstein. What we have on the right is the metadata, the information about this photograph that we've got to put into the computer so that we can find it, so that we can find it easily and share it with other people. We've got to do that basically for those hundreds of thousands of documents that I mentioned that make up the collection, all of the recordings and all of the films. So it's quite a daunting task, and I'm really grateful for our partners. I have two people here from the Historical Society I'd like to call out: Michael Scherer-Zielinski, our digital archivist and preservation manager, Ashlyn Hall, our digital projects assistant, who are doing the work for us at the Historical Society. I'd like to turn it over now to Lisa, who will tell us about the site that the American Jewish Archives is preparing for us. Let me get there. Just a moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I miss you too, believe me. And thank you for welcoming me here. Everybody is so gracious, and I appreciate it very much. I think I'd like to just explain a little bit about why the American Jewish Archives is involved in this project. Most of the papers, the audio and video, are at Western Reserve, but the American Jewish Archives is a partner because of our digital skills and talents at this point in time. The American Jewish Archives began in 1948 under the auspices of Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, who founded the archives with just a few boxes of materials. He set out then to grow the collection and to have scholars come to Cincinnati to review the materials and so forth. Dr. Marcus was not interested in having only original documents. He was willing to keep copies of documents so that the materials would be available to scholars, whether they were originals or not. The benefit of doing this, too, has been that some congregations who've given us copies of their papers, who were not willing to give up the originals, which is fine, had catastrophes at their congregations, floods or other things that happened, and the originals were destroyed, but then the American Jewish Archives has the copies, and that's happened with individuals, rabbis, all kinds of collections that we have where we have copies, but the originals were lost. Dr. Marcus taught at Hebrew Union College and really started the academic field of the study of the American Jewish experience. And he set out to give scholars a chance to, if they were studying the American Jewish experience, to have access to materials. That was his primary goal at the time. After he passed away in the 90s, Dr. Gary Zola came to be the second executive director, and the collection had grown so much that it was crammed into a small building and across the campus of Hebrew Union College. And so he raised the funds to build a massive facility that holds the collection and also gives recognition to more public programming at the American Jewish Archives. So that's where we are. In the early 2000s, we started to think about not only preservation of materials, but giving people access. Of course, I think the most frequently asked question when we give tours at the American Jewish Archives is, why don't you just digitize everything? You know, then everybody can see it, and that would be great. Well, we have literally, 20 million items in the American Jewish Archives, and the time and funding that it would take would be well past, 100 years at this point. So what we've done is we started to create digital collections that were available to not only scholars, but accessible to lay people, congregants, educators, students of all ages and backgrounds. So when we did that, we focused on the easy access to the documents, searchability, and so forth. So we started with the Tannenbaum. Mark Tannenbaum was a rabbi who was very involved in Vatican II and interfaith relations, and his widow, Georgette Bennett, funded us to do one of the first sites that we did, major sites, with over 75,000 documents. And so I'm going to just show you that site really quickly. This is our site. We have a group of digital collections, and you'll see that our major collections are the Isaac Mayer Wise Digital Collection, where we have everything that Isaac Mayer Wise wrote, books, letters, editorials, and so forth. And here's Mark Tannenbaum. We also have the Herbert Friedman Collection, which many of you might know. He was the director of the Wexner Foundation for many years. And then, of course, the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Collection, which I'm sure you would understand why we have that. It's a great collection that is on their educational initiatives. It's not all of their papers, but it is on these two programs that they wanted us to digitize, so they're available for all to see. So what we've done is we've started the silver collection, and this is just a really beta version of the site. We don't have all of the text in and everything, but I wanted to be able to show you what it would look like. And this is the collection home. Eventually, you'll be able to search all the files. And sorry. There we go. We have images that rotate when you land on the site. And of course, these are also part of the collection. I love that one. And then what we would be doing is the archivists at the AJA have put up some materials that are part of the collection at the Western Reserve. So if you click, hold on. We've tried to make these sites as easy as possible for people, every person, not just scholars, to be able to search and look at very simply and straightforwardly. So they put up a section called the MS-4842, which is the Abba Hillel Silver Papers. And so they've just put up a sample. Let me just show you what that looks like. So here there's biographical information certificates, memorial tributes, his naturalization certificates, which I'm going to show you. So when you click read, then you have the materials. And we do this at a folder level, so there's several documents in one file so that you can look at them all. So you can see how scholars around the world, or even any interested learners or educators, can just come to this site. They can search for a specific topic, and then they can just either read, view, listen, or see. Let me just... Here we have the film collection. We have a few of the films loaded up, and some audio as well. So that's what it looks like. And Sean is going to show you some clips, some full clips, which will eventually, of course, be added onto this site, and you'll be able to see. So I hope that if you have any questions or concerns or have any input, that you'll let us know, either Sean or myself, on what you would like to do with these sites, or if you're interested in reviewing the site. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I have two clips to show you. One is a film from the United Palestine Appeal of March 1938. There will be about almost a minute of silence while there's some text, and then you'll hear Abba Hillel Silver speaking in March 1938, and we'll follow that up with a sermon by Daniel Jeremy Silver in 1980.
Can we turn down the light?
One's down.
No, just turn.
My dear friends, this hour in Jewish history is as grave as any which our people have experienced in 2,000 years. A wave of reaction has swept over the Western world, which has already shattered two great Jewish communities in Germany and Austria, and which is threatening with a similar fate other Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. 3 million Jews in Poland live in the midst of almost continuous political and economic attack. They are subjected to numerous restrictions and intolerable hostile propaganda, while the economic plight of more than 1 million of them beggars description. They live in the direst and most abject poverty. It is a time of great affliction for Israel, because it is a time of great affliction for mankind. An unclean spirit, a plague of diseased ideas, risen from the 10 million graves of the last war, has come to dwell in the habitations of mankind. The ghosts of the dark ages, tyranny, oppression, hatred, intolerance, and sheer cold brutality cast their horrible shadows over the lives of men and nations. The rights of the individual are trampled underfoot. The rights of races, religions, and minorities are flaunted. The human mind is shackled.
To human, recognizing the earth.
Okay, so let me just introduce this clip for you. That clip was from the United Palestine Appeal of March 1938. I wanted you to see a bit of the pre-war perspective, and then we're jumping ahead to 1980 with this sermon by Rabbi Daniel Jeremy Silver. He was speaking that day on a report that had been written on in the Plain Dealer, threatening the stability of Israel and posing the question, will Israel survive? And here in this clip, he will pose that question and answer it, and that will conclude his sermon for that day.
Of the needs of which we have been speaking. Will Israel survive? In this world, there are no guarantees. This is the third Jewish commonwealth. First lived and died. Second lived and died. All that lives ultimately dies. But Israel's a young state, and it would be a crime if we and its citizens allowed this great social experiment, this great proof to ourselves of our capacity as a people to renew ourselves, we allowed it to go under. The specifics of the problems which will face us over the next decade can only dimly be decried and described. But this much is clear. Sacrifices will have to be made, most of them by the citizens of Israel itself. Israel will have to be satisfied with less rather than more. Sacrifice, trial. These are not easy words to speak. And we, for our part, will have to make sacrifices too. I believe that there is the will in Israel to struggle through. I remind you that instability is not the same thing as that sensational word crumbling. Instability there will be in Israel. Israel represents an amalgam of communities which have not yet come together. Israel still must fight a Kulturkampf, a terrible ideological war. And that war is going to be bitter, and it's going to be costly. And reason will not prevail. There are going to be troubles aplenty in the next 10 years. Dr. Citrin was right. Israel deserves now a high instability rating. But that doesn't mean that Israel will go under. It doesn't mean that we should surrender and give in. I have very little respect for those who leave any battle, as long as the battle is worth the waging, and this one certainly is. Amen.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you both. I don't think there is a single rabbi in this country or the world who would wish to follow the voices and images of Abba Hillel Silver and Daniel Jeremy Silver. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for the extraordinary work that's being done to make this remarkable collection available to scholars and to interested parties everywhere in the world, and to really spreading the legacy of rabbis Abba Hillel Silver and Daniel Jeremy Silver as they ought to be spread. And we look forward to the culmination of this project, and we are proud, along with the Silver family and so many others, to be partners in this project. And at this moment, I would like us to move forward in our program, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to us our Silver Scholar this weekend and our respondent, and I'm going to ask you to please come up. For those of you who were with us yesterday evening, Ambassador Martin Indyk is going to be our keynote speaker, and Ambassador Indyk comes to us with a 40-year plus history of expertise in Near Eastern and Southeast Asian affairs, starting out in APAC in 1982 and eventually becoming an expert in Washington, D.C. on Near Eastern affairs, leading a Near Eastern affairs think tank and serving under the Clinton administration and with Secretary of State Warren Christopher, both as an expert in Near Eastern affairs and on the National Security Council, to become ambassador to Israel twice in the 1990s all the way to 2000 under President Bill Clinton, to return to the United States of America. Ambassador Indyk has taught extensively, both in the United States and in Australia, eventually returned as peace envoy to the Middle East in 2013-14, really recruited by President Obama to return to the peacemaking effort between Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East, then to become the executive vice president of the Brookings Institution, and then to join as a distinguished fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. We started hearing from Ambassador Indyk last night, and we so look forward to hearing from you today. And Ambassador Indyk will deliver his words, and we will hear a response from David Fleshler. David Fleshler is American-born, but comes from an international background that is as impressive as one can imagine. David Fleshler's parents, actually, I believe his father was a representative of NATO and met his mother, who's I think a British national, in Oslo, in Norway, to return to the United States of America, and then as a child to live in the United Kingdom, and then to eventually graduate, lived in Pepper Pike here, but eventually would graduate from the University of Michigan and the Boston College of Law, and is also a graduate of the Hebrew University, who also worked in Tel Aviv and in Tokyo, and who was recruited by Barbara Snyder, president of Case Western Reserve University, in the effort to internationalize Case Western Reserve University, having worked with the Jewish Federation in Cleveland on international relations for a number of years, and has grown the international profile of Case Western Reserve University, and comes to us with that background that is both Jewish and academic and international, and with that very special vantage point. And we're delighted to have you with us and for you to speak with us about what is happening in academia and in our world from a Jewish perspective and from your remarkable vantage point. So without further ado, Ambassador Indyk, followed by David Fleshler.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Cohen, and good morning, good Shabbos, everybody. I gave a formal address last night, if you could call it that. I thought today, since it's Shabbos and an opportunity for interaction and conversation together, that I would not give a formal address, but give you some thoughts of mine that were triggered by something I read from Abba Hillel Silver and about his life in high politics, relating to his leadership of the struggle to create the Jewish state and his views about the Jewish state. We are, in my view, at a critical moment for Israel. The elections in Israel have create a circumstance in which the majority coalition government, as you're, I think, well aware, comprises the Likud party, a centre-right party, but in coalition with religious parties and far-right extremists, a far-right extremist collection of three different parties who together espouse a rather extreme approach to Israel's future, both domestically and in terms of its relations with the Palestinians. And I say it's a critical moment because a battle that in fact started before the state was established has continued ever since between those who believed that what is critical for Israel's future is to have control over land, over as much land as possible, particularly over the land that God gave to Israel, promised to Israel, which, believe it or not, was Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, not Tel Aviv. And those who believe that Israel can and should survive in a more limited space if it can produce a more peaceful and serene environment for Israel to thrive. And what's interesting about this as we think about Abba Hillel Silver and his legacy is that he had, not surprisingly, views on this issue. At first, and there are people here who know him and his legacy better than me, but they can attest to this, I think. At first, he was absolutely committed to the idea that all of British mandated Palestine should become the land of Israel. Certainly, all of the territory to the west of the Jordan River, but also to the east as well, in the area that has become Jordan today. And he was passionately committed to this geographic vision and found it hard to compromise on that. And it came to a critical moment when the leadership of the Yeshuv, of the Jewish Agency, of which he was the most important American leader involved, had to decide whether they would continue to insist on all of the land of Israel or accept the idea that it should be partitioned and that they would have to accept a truncated part of mandated Palestine. He was vehemently opposed to the decision of the Jewish Agency executive in the summer of 1946 to secretly propose such a partition to the United States and Great Britain. And that flowed, and I'm reading here from one of his biographers, at least in part from an emotional tie to the physical land. But when the time came to compromise, to support partition and accept a truncated state, Silver, the man of vision and cold realism, did so. He infused it, the partition idea, with a higher meaning. Quote, he said, "The land of Israel will be small, made smaller by partition, but the people of Israel will make it great. The monumental contributions to civilization have been made by great people which inhabited little countries. Mind and creative endeavor," he said, "will compensate for what our people have been forced reluctantly to relinquish." And so there, it seems to me, is the encapsulation of this idea. Does Israel need all of the land because God promised it to us? Because we need it for the requirements of a geographical space and security that comes with geographical space? Or should Israel compromise on its territorial claims for a higher purpose, for peace with its neighbours, for an environment in which the people can thrive and all of the creative energies of the Jewish people can find expression in their homeland of Israel. And that dilemma that Abba Hillel Silva had to confront at a critical moment in the process of the creation of Israel is a dilemma that Israel and we who care about Israel's future have to confront today. And it's more real today because of the political circumstances in Israel that I mentioned at the beginning. It's been a struggle that's gone on now for decades, this battle of ideas. Essentially, it was at first decided in 1947 with the acceptance of partition by the Yishuv and the creation of a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, in part of Palestine. What became known as the 67 borders after the 48 borders after the War of Independence. And then in 1967, as a result of the threats to destroy Israel and the mobilization of the Arab armies on Israel's borders, Israel launched a preemptive strike. And that war, the Six-Day War of 1967, as I think you'll be familiar with, left Israel in control of not just the whole of the Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal and all of the Golan Heights in Syria, but also Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, which had been partitioned as well in 47, and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Abba Hillel Silva was no longer alive, so we don't know what position he would have taken. But there was a very strong sense in Israel at the time, and not just on the right, that this was Beshet. This was God's will, that Israel was now in possession of the land that it had been forced to give up in 47 in order to create the state. Jerusalem was almost immediately annexed by a Labour-led government of Levi Eshkol. And the West Bank was put under Israeli military occupation. And even as the government started to build in East Jerusalem almost immediately, in the West Bank, this government, which included what was the predecessor to the Likud, the Herut, under Menachem Begin, this government accepted UN Security Council Resolution 242, which its Foreign Minister Abba Eban had played a critical role in negotiating. And that resolution called for the exchange of territory for peace, a return of territories, not the territories, but a return of territories that Israel had occupied as a result of the Six-Day War to the Arabs that had previously administered that territory, in return for secure and recognized borders and peace with its neighbors. And as I say, the government of Israel accepted Resolution 242. And so there was this inevitable tension created between the desire to incorporate the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, into Israel as part of its historic boundaries of the the state of Israel from biblical days, that tension between that urge, which was in a sense God-driven in the minds of those who felt that this was Israel's to keep, and the government of Israel at the time, and every government since, which has accepted the idea that the territory should be given up in exchange for secure borders and for recognized borders and for peace with its neighbors. And that idea of territory for peace was then elevated by the peace treaty that was negotiated between Israel and Egypt, in which Israel gave up all of the territory that it had occupied in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. All of it back to the international boundary in exchange for peace with Egypt. So it was, in a sense, sanctified politically by the government of Israel. Henry Kissinger, I've just written a book about this time, after the 1973 war, began that process of negotiating territory for peace with two disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt, which laid the foundations for the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt that Jimmy Carter subsequently negotiated. He also negotiated on the same principle the withdrawal of Israeli forces from part of the Golan Heights and the establishment of what became known as the Golan Heights Disengagement Agreement of 1974. And that is an agreement which, again, was based on the idea of giving up territory in order to establish a process that might eventually lead to peace. And that agreement continues to this day up on the Golan Heights. I don't know how many of you know that there's actually a UN observer force up there. Even as Syria has descended into civil war, its government has maintained that agreement, which was based on UN Security Resolution 242. I was involved in the Clinton administration in the efforts to negotiate peace between Israel and Syria, again on the same basis. And I dealt with 5 prime ministers in my time as ambassador in Israel in 4 years, but Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu, Barak, and subsequently, at a later time, Ehud Olmert, as prime ministers, all committed to the United States to give up all of the Golan Heights in exchange for peace with Syria. And that was the basis upon which we negotiated and almost reached an agreement between Israel and Syria in the year 2000. People say, oh, Camp David, you came very close to an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. The truth is we were not close at all. But we were really close between Israel and Syria. I won't go into the details of that story, as interesting as I think it is. But my point is simply this, that even though Israel has now annexed the Golan Heights that remain in its hands, 5 Israeli prime ministers from the left and the right were willing to give up the Golan Heights in fulfillment of Resolution 242 and this concept of territory for peace. But the West Bank has been different because, while some claim that there's some religious imperative about holding on to the Golan Heights, that's not really serious. That was basically has been a security argument. The West Bank, as I said, has been religiously driven. And since 1967, the Bloc of the Faithful, Gush Emonim, which is the heart of the settler movement in the West Bank, have moved assiduously to try to ensure that, notwithstanding the commitments of Israeli governments, that territory would never be given up. And so they settled the land. Settlement, I mean, it was interesting to see Abu Hilal's speech trying to raise money for settling in Israel. Settlement is at the heart of the Zionist enterprise. But settlement in the West Bank came with a lot of other complications, notwithstanding the fact that the government had agreed to negotiate to give it up. It came with the complication of the fact that there were many Palestinians living there. Over the time, some 2 to 2.5 million now living there. But from the point of view of the Gush Emonim, which was the driving force behind this, settling the land would make it impossible. Their objective was to settle the land in a way that would make it impossible for the territory to be given up. Henry Kissinger, as I explained in my book, had the opportunity to affect the course of that struggle for the land by reintroducing Jordan into the West Bank. Israel had disengaged from part of the Sinai, Israel had disengaged from the Golan, as I explained, and there was the opportunity for Israel to have a disengagement agreement with Jordan, which would have put Jordan back into the West Bank. Kissinger, unfortunately, while he liked the king, didn't value Jordan. It was a small state that had no great importance in the balance of power. Egypt was the key for him. To take Egypt out of the conflict with Israel was his driving imperative. So he told the Israelis and Jordanians, you figure it out. And left to their own devices, they could not. But there was a moment there when the Israelis were prepared to withdraw from Jericho and with a corridor to Ramallah. That would have changed the dynamic by putting Jordan back in control of part of the West Bank. That opportunity was missed. And the settlement enterprise continued. When Kissinger left office in 1976, there were 1,600 settlers in the West Bank. Today, there are 350,000 in 131 settlements and 200 settlement outposts. These are illegal settlements under Israeli law, not under international law. They were set up without government approval by the settler movement. And their purpose was to expand the reach of the settlements, of the existing settlements, to deep into the West Bank, so that it would make it impossible to partition that territory. We should have put up a map, and I apologize for that. But the bulk of the Israeli settlers, 80% of them, live close to that green line of the 67 line in major settlement blocks on what amounts to about 5% of the West Bank, so that it became possible when we were involved in negotiating between Israel and the Palestinians to envisage an agreement in which 80% of the settlers would remain, would be annexed to Israel, would be part of Israel, and only 20% would have to be evacuated from outlying settlements deep in the West Bank that had been established over time. Or they could stay there as Israeli citizens, but subject to Palestinian law. And that was essentially what was negotiated at Camp David, and what was the basis for the negotiations I was involved in under the Obama administration in 2013, 2014 with Secretary Kerry. That basic idea that 80% of the settlers would be absorbed into Israel where they lived in the main blocks, and the 20% would have to be evacuated, would have to live in the state of Palestine. And the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, whom we were negotiating with, were ready to accept that, provided, they said, that there would be compensation for the Palestinian state from other territory inside Israel, what became known as mutually agreed swaps. And so that has been the basis, even to this day. There is a willingness on the part of the Palestinian leadership to accept that idea. That was originally put forward by President Clinton and Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, at Camp David. It was subsequently elaborated by Ehud Olmert when he was Prime Minister. But since then, or I should say that Prime Minister Netanyahu was also prepared in 2013 and 2014, when I was involved in the negotiations, to accept that basic idea that the borders would be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps. He had agreed in secret negotiations to that language. But subsequent to that, when the collapse of that negotiations and the continued effort by the settlers to prevent this kind of deal from coming to fruition, there sprang up an effort by them to annex the territories, to formally annex them to Israel, so that there could no longer be any negotiation based on Resolution 242. That movement did not get much traction until Donald Trump came along. And Donald Trump, under the influence of his ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, was willing to accept the idea that Israel could annex parts of the West Bank. And that provided the opening in which the settler movement pushed very hard the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu to annex the territories. And it was a very close-run thing, because the Trump plan for peace between Israel and the Palestinians provided for Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, not the 5% that we had been negotiating with previous Israeli governments, but to essentially give Israel 30% of the West Bank, prior even to negotiations with the Palestinians, as a kind of gift, and the rest would be worked out in negotiations. The thing that Israel had to do in return for this gift was to accept the Trump plan that there would be a Palestinian state in the other 70% of the West Bank. And that was something that the settler movement was, of course, not prepared to accept, and they pressed Netanyahu to oppose it. Netanyahu had already agreed to accept it, was trying to push the annexation. But the whole thing broke down over that. And along came the then Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, who was alarmed at the idea that Israel would annex the Jordan Valley and this would become deeply threatening to the King of Jordan, who presides over a Palestinian majority on the East Bank, and who was deeply troubled by this annexation process. So he intervened, and as you probably remember, offered that instead of annexation, Israel could have full normalization, peace, with the United Arab Emirates. And that deal then put the annexation process on hold. And there is a secret letter given by President Trump to now President of the Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, that Israel would not annex the territories for 3.5 years. Why 3.5 years is a bit of a mystery, but we don't need to go into it. 3.5 years. That 3.5-year period, which was a commitment by Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time, expires sometime, I think, in August of next year. Now, fast forward to today, the new government of Israel is about to be formed. It is, as I explained, a right-wing religious government, which has these two parties, one run by Bezalel Smotrich and the other by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who have as their basic commitments to their base to annex the West Bank, to legalize those illegal outposts, and to basically finish the job that was truncated by the Abraham Accords. And Netanyahu is now in the process of making promises to them that he will do this. First of all, legalizing the illegal settlements and placing the civil administration under the control of Bezalel Smotrich, with a deputy defense minister there to oversee this process of putting all of the Israeli settlers under Israeli law. Because they live in the West Bank, they've been under military occupation law of the defense minister of Israel, which would be another step towards the annexation. And so here we are with the basic question that Abba Hillel Silva had to face back in 1946 and 47. Here we are again with this basic question. Should Israel formally take control of the West Bank with its 2.5 million Palestinians and expand to the land that God promised to Israel, and in the process establish a Jewish state that cannot remain as a democratic state because it will have an Arab majority within its borders, and that means that if it were to give equal rights to all of the Palestinians in the West Bank that it now occupies, but are not citizens of Israel, but would absorb them into Israel, then it could not remain a democratic state. If it didn't give them the rights, and if it did give them the rights, it couldn't be a Jewish state. Or should Israel resist the temptation to annex the territories and preserve the idea that it should give up those territories, most of them, in return for peace with the Palestinians? And even though there is no peace process today, and even though it looks like there isn't a viable partner on the Palestinian side, Israel is faced with this question. And Israel's supporters, all of us, are similarly faced with this same question. I'll finish with something that Ehud Barak said to me when he was Prime Minister, when I accompanied him to Camp David for that fateful summit with Yasser Arafat and Bill Clinton. We were riding in the President's helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base to Camp David. And he was waxing philosophical, and he said, you know, Israel will one day become a state which has given up the West Bank, and Palestine will consist of the West Bank and the East Bank, Jordan, Palestine. It's all going to be essentially the Palestinian state. And Israel will become a city-state with a large metropolis that stretches from Haifa in the north to Ashdod in the south and Jerusalem in the east. A great city-state with a big park called the Negev. He said, and that will be Israel's future. And he said, the question is not what our borders will be. The question is whether we will be Sparta or Athens. And so that was the vision that he had. He thought it was kind of going to be inevitable. But that is the alternative vision here. The vision that Abba Hillel Silver had when he said, the land of Israel will be small, but the people of Israel will make it great. Thank you.
Well, a little hard to follow up Ambassador Indick's remarks. I am not going to respond directly to any of those inside and very compelling and interesting remarks. But I am going to try to provide a little bit of an understanding, not of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver's Zionist proclivities and what he did in his life, but a little bit about what he did here in Cleveland and the way that he approached his rabbinate and trying to incorporate what I see in academia and asking the question, as you did, Ambassador, what would Rabbi Silver do with some of these issues that we see today? But I'd like to start, given that it's a Shabbat morning, with the portion of the week that we have this week, because it is so appropriate to what we're doing here this morning. So the portion is Vayetze, and it's about Jacob's ladder. And I will read the first Aliyah to give you a sense of how, in a sense, remarkable it is that we're having this discussion on this Shabbat morning. Jacob departed from Beersheba and went to Haran. He encountered the place and spent the night there because the sun had set. He took the stones of the place, which he arranged around his head, and lay down in that place. And he dreamt, and behold, a ladder was set earthward, and its top reached heavenward. And behold, angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, God was standing over him, and he said, I am the Lord, God of Abraham, your father, and God of Isaac. The ground upon which you are lying, to you will I give it, and to your descendants. Your offspring shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out powerfully So this is interesting compared to what you just talked about, Ambassador. Westward, eastward, northward, and southward, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and by your offspring. Behold, I am with you. I will guard you wherever you go, and I will return you to this soil, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I have spoken about you. So there is the ancient promise of the return to the land of Israel, which we see today that Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver was perhaps the driver, certainly in the United States, of the Zionist movement that achieved this ancient prophecy. It's sort of remarkable, it seems to me, that we're having this discussion on this day. So I realized, though, that my challenge was what I could talk about regarding Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver and what I perceive would be his views on academia and international higher education. And as I did a little bit of research thinking about Rabbi Silver, I think that he would have been concerned with the same issues that we speak about at Case Western Reserve University and at universities throughout the United States and in many ways throughout the world. And as I read about Rabbi Silver, I realized that like many of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, he came from Russia. He came from Lithuania. And like many of us, our families, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, immigrated. He immigrated at the age of 9 originally to the United States. And as many of you know, the Jewish community in Lithuania, many came to the U.S., but many went to South Africa. And I wonder if your descendants might have done the same, but that's another conversation. So what did Rabbi Silver grow up with until the age of 9? And I don't have the full archives that I've gone through, but I would posit, because this happened clearly in my family and in many of your families, that it was anti-Semitism, that it was cruelty to Jews. That was his background. That's what he saw as a young boy. And what did that mean for him when he came to the United States and when he was growing up? I think it meant two things. One is he realized that the Jewish people needed a place where they could be safe and where they could be able to be Jews. And that then reflected in his Zionism that very early in his life and his career, he was one of the great proponents of. But the other thing that I think that it did, and maybe this was even more foundational, is he realized that social justice for all people was something that we as Jews needed to stand up for because he saw what happened in Lithuania when you didn't have that. So as I did a little bit of research, what I saw in the archives, or in the background that I saw, is that Rabbi Silver did things like, and remember, this is in the 1920s, 1930s, denouncing segregation, supporting the right of labor to organize. He actually resigned from the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce over its anti-union policies. He was a member of a special state labor commission that drafted Ohio's first unemployment insurance law. And he was the founder, and remember this period, and I'd be interested in your comments, Ambassador, this period where there was a question of how aggressive Jews should be in society pre-war. He founded, and there was a lot of objection to this, the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League to champion human rights, which organized a boycott of German goods in the 1930s. So he was very active, not just in the Zionist movement, he was very active locally and nationally in what I'd call social justice kinds of issues. So that then brings me to what I and many of us are concerned about in higher education. The kinds of things that are going on now, the questioning of academic freedom. More and more state legislatures are appointing politically controversial people to lead state university boards of governors. One example is this Florida law that many of you probably know, the Stop Woke Act, which regulates what schools, particularly universities, can teach about race and identity. Academic freedom is something that I think we are worried about today. And I'll posit in a minute what Rabbi Silver may have said about it. Access to higher education is another question. Within the last month, we've seen 2 Supreme Court cases, the Students for Fair Admission versus Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College, and the same with the University of North Carolina, a question of whether affirmative action will continue. And I think I know that at Case Western Reserve are already preparing for the fact that it's likely that the Supreme Court will strike down affirmative action. And what does that then mean for diversity in our university and our educational system? And then really there's the issues that I work most closely with, which has to do with internationalization of higher education. You know, for the last, I'd say since World War II, there's been a general sense that globalization is a good thing, and that internationalization at universities, meaning more international students, meaning sending our students abroad, meaning creating research relationships with universities around the world, that's all good, and we should be doing it. Over the last, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, and maybe going back a little further, all of that is now in question. And we see that there's increasingly pressure on researchers, for instance, not to do research with different countries, with different researchers in different countries. This is particularly true in China, but it's true more and more around the world. And with the tensions between the US and China, with the war in Ukraine, I think we're starting to see less globalization, more regionalization, and for what we do, particularly what I do in international higher education, it's a real question of what that means. Now, I would, I guess, posit that Rabbi Silver would have a voice in all of these areas. And he would stand up and say, we need to make sure that in our universities, academic freedom remains, whatever side people want to speak about, but that state legislatures should not be dictating what is taught in our university system. He would not shy away, I think, from any of these issues. So I'll just end with a story that I found as I was preparing for this session, and I think that it's helpful, certainly to me, but maybe to all of us. The story goes like this, and it was told by a rabbi in Connecticut about his friend. And some of you may know this because this is the shoal that it comes out of, obviously. His friend, this is late in Rabbi Silver's life. His friend was in Philadelphia, and Rabbi Silver was scheduled to speak in Philadelphia. And his friend went to pick up Rabbi Silver, took him to the speech. Only about 20 people were there to hear him. He then took him back. It was a train that he was getting on. Took him back to the train. They were at the station. It was a cold, drizzly, lousy night. And he said to Rabbi Silver, with all due respect, Rabbi, why did you come out to this? You're a world-famous figure. You've appeared in front of thousands of people. The ambassador talked about his reception in Israel when he first went there after the beginning of the state, and there are in the archives the pictures of the thousands who surrounded his automobile. And here you are, late in your career, and only appearing in front of 20 or so people. Why aren't you at home relaxing and basking, basically, in what you've done? And Rabbi Silver, and now I'm going to quote from the sermon that this came from. Rabbi Silver looked at him and said, "I thank you for your caring, but remember Moses. When God told him that he could not go to the promised land, Moses asked if he could go as a foot soldier. He knew that he no longer could be the leader of the Israelites, that he was older and burned out, and that the Israelites needed a new leader to conquer the promised land. But he wanted to go, and he was content to go any way he could, even as a common foot soldier. And so that, my young friend, is why I'm here. I'm a foot soldier now, and I'm happy to play that role." Thank you.
Thank you so much for these presentations, for these magnificent words. Look at where we've been this morning. We started out with a digitization project of the Silver Archive, bringing all of this information to light and making it accessible to everyone digitally, which is coming together through the collaboration between Western Reserve Historical Society and the American Jewish Archives. We continued with a survey, starting with the 1940s, discussion of the identity and borders, the boundaries of the state, the negotiation toward the newborn Jewish state. What would it be like, and should there be a territorial compromise, leading all the way up to the contemporary period, and are now speaking about another side of the Silver legacy, which relates to social justice and to the issues that we encounter here today, which also related to his very thinking about the Jewish state and what the Jewish state should be like. And again, should the Jewish state be a Jewish democracy, and what kind of Jewish democracy should it be? And Rabbi Silver was not shy about his views with regard to what kind of a Jewish democracy Israel should be. And these were, in fact, the speech that he made to the United Nations Committee in May of 1947 outlined in brief the kind of Jewish state he believed it should be. And so this is our opportunity to engage in a question and answer period with our various speakers. We have here a set of note cards and pencils, and I'm going to ask for those of you who wish to ask questions to please raise your hands so that we can ask you to write out these questions. I will then receive these cards, and I will be able to ask questions on your behalf. We have approximately half an hour to ask questions and answer of our various speakers. And if I may, I'm going to start out with the first question to the both of you. It's a fascinating thing that you raise with regard to the notion of Abba Hillel Silver being a visionary and at the same time also being an incrementalist. And the same was true with regard to Abba Hillel Silver as a social justice activist. And it was absolutely fascinating to read your account of the winter of 1973-1974 and the Kissinger negotiations, and that opportunity that arose with regard to the possibility of Jordan then having a foothold in Jericho, and from Jericho moving on to various other parts of the West Bank and the possibility of Jordanian banks entering into the West Bank and to other elements of the administration of Jordan entering into the West Bank, and by the way, to the Moshe Dayan reports of resistance among Palestinians to the idea of the Jordanians becoming, as it were, the dominant power or the leaders of the West Bank. And I wanted to really ask a question with regard to vision and to incrementalism. And the question that I wanted to ask the both of you on both of these issues that relate to social justice and to freedoms and liberties, including the freedom of conscience and the freedom of speech and the freedom of academics to express their views, which Abba Hillel Silver actually spoke about on a number of occasions. What do you believe occurs under circumstances wherein the reality on the ground, the political reality on the ground, either in the United States or in Israel, in a sense creates a puzzle which was not unlike the puzzle that Kissinger faced, wherein the likelihood was of greater success in achieving disengagement between Israel and Egypt and Syria, but it was actually in the long run more important to achieve a disengagement that involved the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and yet the reality on the ground would not allow for this kind of advance. What occurs under circumstances wherein, in the long run, our struggle for freedoms and for rights here is more important. But the realities on the ground, the political realities on the ground, do not allow us to fight and to successfully achieve those kinds of rights and freedoms here and now. Where do we go from here? What do we do?
A big question. First of all, I have to thank you, David. A few weeks ago, I addressed an audience in Denver at the JCC, and there were only 20 people that turned out. So now I have a way of thinking about it that is much more constructive than the way I thought at that particular moment. And it's also interesting that Rabbi Silver invoked Moses, because I actually last night referred to this, this very notion that he, like Moses, was not allowed to cross over. Well, actually, Moses was not allowed to cross over, but Abba Hillel Silver chose not to cross over, that is, to become an Israeli citizen once the state of Israel was created, but rather to continue with pursuing his vision of a balance between the state of Israel and the American Jewish community and his concept of an American Jewish Zionism. So it all kind of comes together in your story. So thank you for that. Look, I think that what you're getting at, Rabbi Cohen, is that great men and women are great because they have a vision and an ability to achieve it. And the great danger, I think, with those people who have a vision of the future is that they want to try to achieve it in one go, in one leap, and therefore fail. And I say that because in my own experience as a practitioner of peacemaking Arab-Israeli peacemaking, and as somebody who has advised two presidents and studied how other presidents dealt with this, there was this great desire on the part of these presidents to be the ones who grasped the Holy Grail, to be the ones who made peace in the Middle East, to be the ones who got the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was true of Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford and Donald Trump. And the desire to play that role was reinforced by the sense that American presidents tend to have of manifest destiny. That here you are as the president of the most powerful country on earth, and you want to do something with your power, and especially if you have a vision, say of peace or of social justice, you want to try to achieve that. And look how many times we see what happens as a result of that imperative that leads to an overreach and disaster, inflicted not just on the United States, but on people, let's say, of Iraq or Afghanistan or so on. So, and it's true in the Arab-Israeli context too, where we tried, Camp David being a good example of this, we tried to jump to resolving the issue in one go, and we fell short, and the failure there created the circumstances in which, for the explosion of the Intifada, in which thousands of Israelis and Palestinians were killed, and the whole process was destroyed, never to be resurrected again, notwithstanding the efforts of 4 subsequent presidents. So there's a long way of getting to answer your question about incrementalism, that great people with great visions need to approach their objective, in my view, based on my experience, need to approach them in a cautious way, in a conservative way, even though the vision is far from that. Because change that comes incrementally is more solid and more long-lasting than change which is attempted in one leap and results in failure and the exact opposite of what you're trying to achieve. Mm.
So I would just add a couple of thoughts to that, because I basically agree with the idea that we're not going to solve the issues that are in front of us fully overnight. And what's the great Martin Luther King quote that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but it's an arc and it doesn't happen immediately. I would reflect to where we were in 1954, let's say, at the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Are all of the issues of discrimination, of racism, of what we know, anti-Semitism in this country, have we gotten over those? Clearly not. Are we at a different point today than we were in 1954? Clearly we are. Mm-hmm. And I think it's up to all of us. So to go back to the last quote that I provided about Rabbi Silver, it's up to all of us to be foot soldiers in trying to make that happen.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I have to say, I have a relatively balanced set of questions here that we're not going to be able to address. There are far too many of them, but there are roughly 50-50 for the both of you. And in certain ways, they're related. So I am going to start asking you questions. Forgive me, but I'm going to rephrase some of your questions so that we are able to do this in a timely way. And I'm going to ask you to respond to these questions. I'm going to limit these questions to 2 each at this point, and I'm going to start with 1 for each one of you. I'm going to start with you, if I may, David, just for a moment. There are 3 sets of questions here that I'm going to summarize into 2. The first is, and I'm again rephrasing, please forgive me for rephrasing. There is a sense of a younger generation of Jewish students in academia, throughout universities and colleges in the United States of America, who support BDS and who are no longer supporting the right of the State of Israel to exist. This is true for non-Jewish students, and it is true for Jewish students. And would you be willing to speak to the question of free speech and the rise of that movement that effectively undermines the 1947 resolution that we have been celebrating this weekend, Resolution 181, that calls for the establishment of the State of Israel to begin with?
Well, not easy questions that are being asked here. Look, in the way that I think both of us answered the previous question, the real issue here, I think, is education for our young people. And there is a rise in young people, as you say, both Jewish and non-Jewish, questioning the State of Israel, questioning what it does and how it does it. I would say that will increase with this new government because of how the new government is, at least from what we can see, how it is going to position itself vis-a-vis social justice, Arabs, and how it looks at these issues. At the same time, I think it's important for all of us to be speaking to our children about the balance here. I think what often is missing in this conversation is that so much is placed on the State of Israel. I mean, if you look throughout the world, the State of Israel is not the only place that has tensions between their people. And in fact, you can make a great argument, and I think many of us do, that if you look to Syria, clearly if you look to Russia, Yemen, etc., that Israel, the only reason that Israel is placed in the kind of spotlight that it is that there may be some anti-Semitism that is part of that, but also because Israel holds itself up in a way that these other regimes don't. And so I go back to the idea that we all need, and I look at Amy Kaplan sitting here from the Federation, and many of us who are quite involved, we all need to make sure that our students, our children, have a balanced view of these things, and then it doesn't necessarily get carried on to university.
Thank you. Amen to that. Ambassador Indyk, again, I'm going to summarize here, there are 3 sets of questions for you, and I'm going to summarize them into 2. But the first is, and this is repeated in a number of these questions, the question basically is there a Palestinian partner for Israel to make peace with? Is there a prospect for Israel to be a safe state with internationally recognized boundaries to begin with in the Middle East? Has the moment passed for that to happen? And I'm adding in, if that moment did pass, what are the prospects for Israel in the Middle East?
So first of all, the question of a Palestinian partner. Today, if you look at the state of the Palestinian leadership, you see an 86-year-old leader in Abu Mazen who is in poor health and has lost all confidence, self-confidence, because he lacks legitimacy amongst his people. He never goes out and meets with them, hasn't for years, for fear of how they would react to him. He's in, I think, the 13th or 14th year of his 4-year term as president. So he fundamentally lacks legitimacy and therefore lacks confidence to lead his people. He exercises control at best over the city of Ramallah and not beyond that in the West Bank, where the Israeli army tends to operate to try to deal with terrorist threats. And, by the way, which would say threats to Abu Mazen as well from Hamas that would like to overthrow him. And so, looking at the situation today, you'd have to say there isn't a partner to negotiate with. Abu Mazen is a man of peace, even though he's often accused of supporting terrorism and inciting terrorism and so on. That's just for tactical advantage. He's a man of peace who's committed to peace with Israel, who's committed to opposing the use of violence on the Palestinian side. He has a clear and long record of that, but he has no ability to enforce it or pursue the peace that he is committed to. And so that's a big problem for anybody who believes that the only way to secure Israel's future is to separate from the Palestinians and to have an arrangement where they govern themselves and Israel does not occupy them and does not govern them. It's very hard to make the case on a practical level. What do you do if you don't have a partner for that? And so I would ask you to think about it from a little different perspective, which is that Israel has a fundamentally different problem in trying to make peace with the Palestinians than it has had with all of its other neighbors, which are states, some of them not very strong states, Lebanon being a good example, but are still states with institutions and the capability of fulfilling their agreements. Israel and Lebanon just reached a maritime agreement, amazingly, even though Hezbollah essentially controls the Lebanese government. The Palestinians don't have a state. And so there's a massive imbalance between Israel and its would-be Palestinian partner for peace. Israel controls all the territory involved in the, even though it's kind of nominally given up 40% of the West Bank to Palestinian control. The Israeli army operates there at will. So Israel controls all of the territory in question. And Israel is the strongest, militarily strongest power in the Middle East, economically thriving, enjoys relations with the United States, has a strong and deep alliance with us, and relations with all of the major powers, Russia and China and the EU and so on, and peace with its major Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, the Abraham Accords countries, eventually, fairly soon, I expect, Saudi Arabia as well. And so it's in a very strong position vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It's not this weak little country that we've been so worried about its survival for so long. News bulletin, that's over. Yes, of course, there has to be a concern about Iran's intentions, but just take it from me that Israel has plenty of ability to deal with anything that Iran can put up there, including nuclear weapons, which Iran doesn't have. So Israel is the strong party here. And Israel needs a Palestinian partner in order to make peace. So I would argue that it's in Israel's interest, self-interest, enlightened self-interest, to build a Palestinian partner, not to tear it down, not to sanction it, not to punish it, but to try to build it up. And that is something which Yitzhak Rabin understood very well. And if Yitzhak Rabin had not been assassinated, I firmly believe we would be in a completely different place today. Because he understood Arafat, and he understood how to deal with Arafat, and to build a relationship of trust with this basically untrustworthy figure. Because this was the guy that could deliver, who had the legitimacy with the Palestinian people, that could deliver. And his whole approach was incremental, but it was based on an effort to build up the Palestinians as a partner and bring Jordan into that process. And it seems to me that that's the way that Israel needs to approach this challenge. There's going to be a new leadership in the Palestinian areas. Abu Mazen is going to leave the scene sooner rather than later. And then there's going to be a struggle for power, which Israel has considerable influence over. And Israel can find a way to build the partner. So I think that's the challenge. Unfortunately, we and Israelis have gotten satisfied with this idea that there's no partner, and therefore it's not our problem. But it is our problem. It really is our problem if we want Israel to find a way to get out of this terrible dilemma that it faces, of what to do with the Palestinians. So I'm sorry that the second question has completely slipped my mind.
Well, that was plenty. That was really a special answer. I appreciate that. I think you know, the other side of this question, I'm going to just add it here because you've partly answered the second part of the question, but I would like you to respond to this just briefly, if I may, but really address this. Two questions here on my card say, the Palestinians are claiming the right of return of Palestinian refugees to the state of Israel. In other words, they themselves are denying the right of the state of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. The question that I asked in the second part of the question is it too late? In other words, not only is there a Palestinian partner and what do we do about a Palestinian partner, but are we now in a dynamic wherein a solution to this is going to be based upon power or upon some kind of negotiated settlement Right, please.
So the key word in your question is solution. If we want a solution to this conflict, in my view, there is only one solution. It's called the two-state solution. Every other solution, in quotation marks, is a recipe for the continuation of conflict. Whether it's the Palestinian solution, which is equal rights for all under Israel's control, in which the Palestinians then become a majority and the Jewish state is no more. Israel's not going to go along with that. Israel's not going to commit suicide, hand over the keys. So that's not a solution. That's just a recipe for continuing the conflict. And the same with those that I was talking about, the Gush Emonim, the settlers, who believe that the answer is a Jewish state in all of the land that God promised Israel, the Jews. And that's not a solution either, because they don't have a solution. Well, what are they going to do about the 2.5 million Palestinians that they're occupying? They're not going to give them equal rights for what we just discussed. So that's not a solution either. There is only one solution, which is to separate. And so then quickly to the right of return. It doesn't lend itself to a quick answer. But yes, there are certainly Palestinians who the Palestinian Authority claims a right of return. And that is deeply threatening to Israel. And the US position on this has been made very clear in the process of the negotiations, that in the settlement, which provides for a Palestinian state living alongside Israel in peace, there will be no right of return to Israel. There will be a right of return for Palestinians to the state of Palestine, not to the Jewish state of Israel. And Abu Mazen, we will miss him when he goes, because Abu Mazen was, as the leader of the Palestinians, was prepared to negotiate an arrangement which essentially separated the right of Palestinians to return to actually what would happen in the agreement. And what would happen is that Palestinians would get to choose whether they went to Palestine or to Australia or to the United States or to Canada. They would be repatriated to different places and Israel. But in every case, the government would have the sovereign right to decide who came in and how many came in. And all he wanted was to be able to show that they had a choice. But Israel would decide how many. Excuse me. And so that was the practical basis, together with compensation for the Palestinian refugees, for property and suffering and so on. And that is essentially the way it can be resolved. The Palestinian refugees will have to give up their right of return to Israel, but they will be compensated in the process.
Right, which brings us back to the negotiations with Olmert, with Prime Minister Olmert. Thank you so much. I have another set of questions for you, and I'm going to combine them yet again. 3 of my questions relate directly to the student government resolution at Case Western Reserve University just recently. And really the bottom line question that is being asked here is, and I'm rephrasing the question, how does one respect and protect freedom of speech while maintaining respectful, kind, constructive conversation in an academic setting and in a civic setting?
Well, I think the answer to the question is embedded in the question. One of the hallmarks, I think, in academia generally, and specifically at Case Western Reserve, is to have respectful speech in a case, in every case, but certainly in a case of issues that are difficult for people to deal with, that you have emotions on each side. I can tell you that in this student government resolution, we have an international student council. And these are people who, students from many different countries, India, China, Peru, etc. And they have been upset about this resolution, partly because of the resolution and partly because of President Kaler's response. And I sat with them, and they were, first of all, incredibly respectful in how they approached the issue. And they said, and I went through probably a 10-minute of level setting what this was about, and said at the beginning, this is a real teachable moment. Many of you come from countries that don't allow the kind of freedom of expression, freedom of thought. The fact that the student government is able to pass a resolution which the administration clearly is not happy about gives you an indication that there is academic freedom, there is free speech. And so let's recognize that and let's celebrate that to begin with. What they were most, they were very clear to say that they also worried about anti-Semitism. They also worried about the fact that a resolution like this could put Jews in a harmful way. But that isn't what they intended. Now, you can look at the BDS movement and you can get behind the doors of the BDS movement and say that the ultimate goal is an anti-Semitic goal. The ultimate goal is maybe the elimination of the state of Israel. But for many of these students, that's not what they see. And so in terms of being able to talk, I go back to the answer that I gave to the previous question, that this means that we have to both speak respectfully on every side, but also listen to what the issues are about. And I think that by doing that, it preserves the right of speaking on campus on each side, and at the end of the day, can provide some understanding for people that are on different sides.
Thank you. Thank you. And wouldn't that hold for all of us, beyond academic institutions, but for all of us? Friends, lunch is awaiting us outside, so we are about to close, and I'm going to close this session by thanking all of you for being here, by thanking the Silver family yet again, by thanking our colleagues from the Western Reserve Historical Society and the American Jewish Archives, and with a comment that was made by Rabbi Klein here with regard to this event, and a comment that hopefully will sustain our conversation over lunch. Is it conceivable that the incrementalists, and I'm rephrasing his comment, have had their way, and that it is the incrementalists in the people who are the followers of Gush Emunim, who have led through their vision of Gush Emunim, who have really in certain ways had their way in Israel, and other incrementalists in this country who have perhaps also had their way in terms of diminishing our rights and freedoms. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to joining you at lunch.